Everyone thinks the great tribulation will begin out there. Wars, earthquakes, governments, chaos. But what if I told you it's already begun within you? Carl Jung said that when the unconscious is ignored, it manifests as destiny. And that's exactly what Jesus tried to avoid when he left clear instructions about the end. He wasn't just talking about signs in the heavens, but symptoms in the soul, of dormant consciences, of hearts beset by fear, of people who mistake security for salvation. The most disturbing thing is realizing that everything he foretold is already before our eyes, not as a distant prophecy, but as a mirror. The Bible was right, not because it predicts correctly, but because it understands human nature better than any modern psychologist. It understands that the shadow isn't in governments, it's in the ego. That the mark of the beast isn't technology, it's blind obedience to lies. And while the world seeks shelter, God still speaks silently, "Come out of her, my people." This phrase isn't a threat, it's a direction. It's a call to those who feel that time has accelerated, that something invisible is changing everything, and that the self, that divine spark within us, begins to awaken from an ancient slumber. But do we still know how to listen? Spirituality today has become a product, and faith a performance. Modern man repeats God's name, but lives absent from his presence. And perhaps that's precisely why Jesus warned so urgently, because he knew that the worst blindness would be spiritual. The Bible is not a book of terror. It is a survival map for the soul. And the time for merely understanding is over. Now is the time to obey. What comes next is not fear, but lucidity. Because the judgment that begins in the world is the same that begins within the awakening. The world always sends signals before it collapses. The problem is, almost no one pays attention. Carl Jung would say that the collective unconscious murmurs before it screams, and those who learn to listen to this murmur understand what most call coincidence. Jesus spoke precisely of this when he warned of the end, not as a punishment but as an awakening. While many await a trumpet from heaven, the true alarm is already ringing within the soul, a subtle unease, a discomfort with what once seemed normal. It's the shadow moving, asking to be seen. And those who ignore this call repeat the same mistakes of generations that mistook comfort for salvation. Spirituality, when genuine, is not anesthesia, it's shock. It's the invisible hand that shakes those who have fallen asleep amid distractions. The self, this silent spark of God within us, whispers clear directions, get up and walk. But the ego, full of certainties, still wants to stay, to plan, to control. And it is in this hesitation that many get lost. The alarm of the end is not made of sirens, but of premonitions. It appears in the empty gaze of those who have lost their sense of purpose, in the aimless rush, in the fear disguised as productivity. Carl Jung called this a symptom of disconnection from presence. Jesus called it hardened hearts. The language changes, but the phenomenon is the same. When humans distance themselves from presence, the shadow is born, and from it come wars, crises, and spiritual loneliness. Therefore, Jesus' instructions seem more psychological than religious. He doesn't say, prepare yourselves with weapons, but leave this place. Don't look back. And it's the same advice the unconscious gives when something within us has already died. Don't go back. Don't try to save what was. Obedience, in this sense, is not submission. It is spiritual intelligence. It is understanding that fear attempts to negotiate what the self has already decided to abandon. There is wisdom hidden in this chaos that seems to surround the world. The collective collapse is merely a reflection of the individual collapse of millions who have stopped listening to their souls. Jung said that he who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens. And it is this inner gaze that defines those who survive spiritually when everything falls apart. The end, after all, doesn't come all at once. It begins slowly when we forget what is real. Genuine spirituality isn't about protecting ourselves from fear, but about walking with presence within it. Because the true alarm isn't about destruction, but about remembrance, that the self continues to guide even when everything seems to be falling apart. And those who listen to this silent voice don't need to run, just obey. The next step always reveals itself to those who trust enough not to demand the entire map. When Jesus said, "Flee to the mountains," he wasn't just talking about external geography, but about an inner movement. Judea symbolizes the territory where the ego feels safe, the spiritual comfort zone, where one believes one can negotiate chaos. Carl Jung would say it's the domain of the persona, that mask that makes us appear controlled while everything inside us is already crumbling. The problem is that many confuse stability with purpose. They remain where God has already asked them to leave because they fear the void between one destination and another. Spirituality, however, is made of crossings. When the self calls, the path is never explained, only felt. Fleeing to the hills is obeying the impulse of life before the collapse of the ego becomes irreversible. And this obedience requires something few are willing to do: relinquishing certainty. The true leap doesn't happen when the ground disappears, but when presence becomes more solid than fear. Every spiritual escape is, in fact, an act of courage in disguise. Jung said that the shadow is not an enemy, but the portal through which the soul must pass to find its wholeness. And this is what Judea represents, the point where faith ceases to be theory and becomes inner survival. Jesus didn't say, "Pack your bags," he said, "Flee now." This is a vivid metaphor for the moment when consciousness realizes that continuing is worse than leaving. How many people today remain in relationships, jobs, or habits that have already become emotional ruins? How many still believe they can save what has already been condemned by time? Authentic spirituality begins when human beings understand that there are situations in which loving themselves means leaving. And leaving, in this context, is obedience to the call of the self, not selfishness. What seems like escape in the eyes of the world is, in fact, silent liberation in the eyes of God. The curious thing is that the path to the mountains is never comfortable. The mountain, symbolically, is the place of isolation, of confrontation with one's own shadow. It is there that the ego tries to argue, saying it would be safer to return. But anyone who has heard the call knows, to return is to die slowly. Obedience here is not about following rules, but about trusting the rhythm of the invisible. It is when the individual allows themselves to be led without understanding the route. Carl Jung would call this surrender to the wisdom of the unconscious, where the self guides the process of individuation. The soul that obeys this call does not flee the world. It flees the false self. And that is why, for many, this moment arrives disguised as loss, confusion, or rupture. But those who perceive the presence amidst the chaos understand the desert that awaits ahead is not punishment, but preparation. And the sound of the mountains, which once seemed distant, begins to become the new spiritual home. Babylon is not just a city lost on the maps of history, it is a state of consciousness, a prison overlooking luxury. It represents everything humankind has built to escape silence, haste, consumption, the noise of crowds. Carl Jung would say that Babylon is the archetype of the collective persona, the social face that shines while the soul fades. And that is why Jesus said, "Come out of her, my people." It is not just a physical command, but a spiritual one. It is an invitation to abandon the internal system that idolizes control. True spirituality is subversive because it makes the individual realize that what the world calls success is in fact a golden shadow. How many people claim to be free, but cannot go a day without the applause of others? How many live trapped in the image they created of themselves, lacking the courage to listen to their own self? Babylon is comfortable, but it is a decorated cage, and those who remain in it for too long forget the sound of their own presence. When the sacred text says that in 1 hour Babylon will fall, it's not just talking about economics or politics, it's talking about the speed with which illusions crumble when the soul awakens. Everything built on lies crumbles at the exact time the truth manifests. Jung called this the collapse of the persona, when the character we create to survive can no longer bear the weight of its own incoherence. And it is precisely at this point that the process of individuation begins, the journey back to reality. Obedience then takes on another meaning, leaving what seems stable to follow what is true. This can mean moving to a new city, giving up an addiction, ending a career, or simply remaining silent. Spirituality demands renunciation because the ego thrives on comfort. And ironically, it is when everything seems to be crumbling that something begins to blossom. The human beings return to presence, to simplicity, to what cannot be bought. Babylon, in its modern form, lives within screens, goals, and inflated egos. It is the system that transforms spirituality into marketing and faith into currency. Carl Jung warned that the more civilization advances, the more the individual loses himself. And perhaps this is what Jesus meant when he commanded, "Come out of her." It's not about abandoning the physical city, but about ceasing to participate in the collective mentality that confuses movement with purpose. Leaving Babylon is an act of obedience to one's own spirit, a silent break with the theater of shadows. It means choosing authenticity, even if it costs status, recognizing that true presence isn't displayed, it's lived. And when this decision is made, something changes forever. The noise of the world no longer seduces, and the silence of God begins to speak. It is at this point that human beings discover that freedom was never an address, but a vibration. And it is precisely this vibration that leads them to the next test, the invisible idol that many still mistake for protection. The modern mind believes it can build security with bricks and passwords. It's curious. The more a person accumulates, the more afraid they become of losing it. Carl Jung would say this is the ego trying to protect itself from its own shadow. The bunker, in this sense, is more than a physical shelter. It is the symbol of spiritual self-sufficiency. It represents the human being trying to replace faith with planning. And that's why Jesus was so clear when he said, "Let him who is on the roof not come down." He knew that the greatest danger is not the collapse of the world, but the collapse of presence. The individual who lives based on the illusion of control builds luxurious prisons and calls them security. But the self, this divine spark, does not dwell in vaults. It breathes only in the space of trust. True spirituality is the opposite of the bunker. It doesn't accumulate defenses, it cultivates surrender. And obedience is its cement, the courage to continue even without guarantees. When people try to protect themselves from everything, they end up isolating themselves from that which strengthens them most, communion with the invisible. The modern bunker is made of routine, status, reputation, structures that erect walls between human beings and the meaning of life. Jung said that the unconscious is like a house. If you lock the doors out of fear, you also block the light from entering. And this is exactly what happens when the soul believes it can survive without spirituality. The shadow grows in the cracks of fear, feeding on the certainties the ego builds. Jesus, on the other hand, offered a radically different path. Trust, walk, and I will sustain you. Obedience to this voice is what keeps the flame of presence alive. It's not about ignoring prudence, but about understanding that true preparation isn't physical, it's spiritual. The bunker may protect the body, but it never saves the soul, and those who live too locked away end up suffocating by their own breath. The paradox is that the more human beings try to protect themselves, the more vulnerable they become. The bunker, which should be a refuge, becomes a cave. The shelter becomes a prison. The fear that builds walls also creates distances. Spirituality doesn't promise the absence of pain, but offers something infinitely greater: direction amidst the darkness. Carl Jung said that enlightenment is not achieved by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is what the self does when it invites us to abandon the bunker. It calls us back to the sacred risk of faith, because presence only manifests in those who dare to come out of hiding. Obedience, in this case, is a leap into the invisible. And those who dare to leap discover something surprising: that God was never outside the walls, but always within those who had the courage to open them. The next step is to understand where this call leads, and why the battlefield is not outside, but within us. When the sacred text speaks of Jerusalem surrounded by armies, it describes something much greater than a physical war. It speaks of the soul surrounded by thoughts, pressures, and fears. Carl Jung would call this the siege of the shadow, the moment when the unconscious demands to be looked at, and there is nowhere left to flee. Each of us has our own inner Jerusalem, that point where faith is tested, where spirituality ceases to be theory and becomes resistance. It is at this moment that human beings must choose between reacting with panic or responding with presence. Jesus never promised an absence of conflict, but taught that victory lies in the center, not on the edges. When everything around us crumbles, obedience becomes a compass. It is the simple gesture of continuing to believe, even when the world seems to be collapsing. And it is there, in this symbolic siege, that the self begins to reveal itself, not as an escape, but as a silent fortress within the chaos. Jerusalem, spiritually, is the human heart. It is the place where light and shadow wage daily battle. Carl Jung said that no one becomes whole without first going through their own conflict. And this is the meaning of the besieged city. It is not punishment, it is a process. The siege is pedagogical. It forces the soul to remember where its true center lies. While the ego runs in circles trying to save face and control outcomes, the self observes in silence, waiting for its presence to awaken. Because when spirituality becomes practice, fear loses its authority. Obedience here is not submission, it is focus. It is looking within when everyone screams to look outside. It is praying when everything tells you to run. It is remaining within yourself when the world calls for despair. This is the inner Jerusalem, the point at which external chaos no longer has power over the internal state. When the soul understands this metaphor, the siege ceases to be a threat and becomes a master. Every fear, when embraced, becomes a portal. Every limit, when crossed with presence, reveals wisdom. The external shadow dissolves in the light of inner understanding. Jung explained that what we resist persists, what we accept transforms. And this is exactly what Jesus demonstrated when he faced Golgotha, the greatest human siege overcome by surrender. The secret is not in fighting the armies that surround us, but in not letting them in. Mature spirituality is this art, remaining centered in the midst of war. The self, when awakened, needs no walls, because it becomes a wall. And those who learn this discover that the siege has always been an invitation. God uses the collapse to remind us that the center still exists, and it is there, in the silence of the heart, that salvation begins to breathe again. The desert is the place where God whispers what comfort silences. Carl Jung said that all genuine transformation requires solitude, not the absence of people, but the encounter with silence itself. Jesus was taken to the desert before beginning his mission because no one can speak with authority about the world if they have not learned to listen within themselves. The desert is not punishment, it is preparation. It is the space where the ego dies of thirst and the self begins to flourish. When all that is superfluous falls away, only presence remains. It is there that spirituality ceases to be discourse and becomes survival. Obedience in this context is not escape, it is total surrender. Following a voice without a map, trusting in a promise without a date, walking by faith and not by sight. The desert teaches what luxury never will. That fulfillment comes not from possession, but from conscious dependence on God. Most people fear the desert because it offers no distractions. There's no Wi-Fi for the ego there. And that's precisely why the desert heals. It removes the noise so the soul can hear again. Jung would say that it is in the void that the unconscious reveals its deepest symbols. And it is in this arid space that the self speaks. It is where the shadow shows itself without masks, and where we learn to forgive ourselves. Every grain of sand is a reminder of impermanence, and every starry night is an invitation to humility. Authentic spirituality feeds on this contrast. The desert represents the laboratory of consciousness. There, presence becomes nourishment, and silence, prayer. Those who learn to walk amid absence discover the invisible abundance, and suddenly, everything that seemed like loss reveals itself as training. Obedience here is not passivity, it is active trust, a yes to the mystery that has not yet been revealed. But the desert also has its untamed beauty. In it, the wind molds everything that is rigid. And it is precisely this movement that symbolizes the action of the spirit, breaking the structure of the ego until it becomes light enough to be carried. Jesus was sustained in the desert by the bread of heaven, and modern human beings are called to sustain themselves through faith. Carl Jung would say that the person who learns to dialogue with the invisible no longer fears the unknown, because they understand that the self is both a compass and a shelter. This is why the desert is the place where obedience matures, where fear dissolves in presence, and where the shadow ceases to frighten because it is understood. Those who cross this place do not return the same. They leave with eyes that see beyond forms, with a heart trained in trust, and with a faith that no longer depends on miracles, but on intimacy. And it is this intimacy that begins to reveal the next secret, the deception that seduces even those who think they are saved. The soul's greatest danger has never been overt evil, but disguised good. Carl Jung called this the light side of the shadow, that part of us that believes we're doing the right thing while unconsciously fueling our own downfall. The Bible calls it deception. And when the text speaks of a brand, of someone who will neither buy nor sell, it's describing much more than a physical symbol. It's speaking of the surrender of consciousness to collective illusion. Modern man, driven by fear and convenience, trades his inner freedom for systems that promise security. And without realizing it, he kneels before that which imprisons him. Adulterated spirituality is exactly that, appearing awake while sleeping with one's eyes open. True obedience, however, is born of presence, not imposition. It is the courage to choose the invisible when the visible seems more comfortable. The self does not negotiate principles because it knows that each concession to lies costs a fragment of the soul. Ojus and Jung would agree on something essential. Deception is only effective because it appears true. The enemy arrives not cloaked in darkness, but in artificial light. And the modern world, with its perfect aesthetics and discourses of selective empathy, is the ideal stage for this farce. When spirituality becomes a spectacle, it loses its power to transform. When fear guides decisions, the shadow takes the throne. And this is precisely what the mark represents, a mind conditioned to obey the loudest voice, not the wisest. Today, this mark manifests itself in small actions. When someone betrays their values for approval, silences their conscience for fear of rejection, or chooses what is easy over what is true. The self, however, is incorruptible. It continues to call, even amidst the noise. And those who learn to listen to this voice rediscover its presence as an antidote to deception, a return to the silent obedience that liberates. But deception isn't just collective, it's intimate. It's self-deception, the most dangerous kind of all. Carl Jung said that there is no awakening of consciousness without pain, because seeing the truth requires shattering the illusions that sustain the ego. True spirituality forces us to face the mirror and admit how much we prefer the comfort of lies. And that's precisely where obedience becomes light again. Obedience isn't following orders, it's responding to the call of the self with humility. It's saying yes to the truth, even when it destroys everything we've built to appear strong. Presence is the seal of those who don't allow themselves to be marked. It's the awakened gaze amidst the hypnotized crowd. And the most curious thing is that those who live by truth inevitably end up becoming different. And it's this difference, this refusal to bow to the system, that marks the children of light. And now, the next challenge is even more subtle. Recognizing the voice that guides and not confusing it with the noise of the world. Not every sound we hear comes from God, and that's why the soul must learn to listen. Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice, I know them, and they follow me." Carl Jung would call this listening to the self, the ability to distinguish the whisper of the soul from the noise of the ego. In times of constant noise, this listening becomes a miracle. The modern mind has been trained to react to everything, but rarely to listen. And the result is a kind of spiritual deafness, people full of information but empty of direction. True spirituality begins when silence ceases to be uncomfortable and becomes a dwelling place. It is in silence that the self speaks, and in presence that it manifests itself. Obedience at this point is not about submission, but about attunement, aligning with the divine frequency, like someone finding the right station after years of noise. Learning to hear the shepherd's voice is an exercise in perception. It doesn't happen overnight. Jung said that consciousness needs to mature to recognize what is internal and what is projection. This applies to faith as well. Many confuse emotion with revelation, haste with purpose, desire with direction. The shadow loves to disguise itself as intuition. Therefore, discernment is necessary, the kind of sensitivity that only arises in presence. The world calls you to react, but God invites you to respond. It's different. Reacting is fear, responding is faith. And true obedience arises in this space between impulse and listening. When the heart learns to wait, chaos loses its power. The spirituality that listens more than it speaks discovers an ancient wisdom. The shepherd never shouts, only speaks softly enough for only those who truly love him to hear. This is divine pedagogy, teaching through silence. And the most beautiful thing is realizing that this voice never tells us to do the impossible. It only asks us to take the next step. The self doesn't reveal the entire map, only the road ahead. Carl Jung believed that God speaks to us through symbols, and that a mature soul is one that has learned to translate these signs. This is why often divine guidance arrives as a gentle intuition, an inexplicable discomfort, a peace that makes no rational sense. Presence captures what the mind tries to explain, and those who practice this daily listening through prayer, meditation, and observing their own thoughts develop a kind of spiritual radar that the world cannot steal. Obedience becomes natural, faith ceases to be effort, and spirituality becomes a rhythm, not an obligation. Because, deep down, what the shepherd always wanted was not fearful followers, but souls mature enough to walk alongside. And it is from this intimate journey that something few understand is born, the power to remain faithful when everyone else gives up. Not everyone will bear the weight of truth when the veil falls. There has always been a silent minority who choose fidelity over convenience, and it is these who the Bible calls the remnant. Carl Jung would say they are the souls who no longer identify with the collective persona, those who refuse to betray their self to please the world. They are people who walk among the ruins of civilization, but carry within themselves an intact temple, the presence. This group is not defined by religion, but by conscience. They are those who obey not out of fear, but out of love. Obedience for them is a spontaneous response to the inner voice they recognize as truth. They are those who, amidst chaos, maintain peace. And the curious thing is that they don't consider themselves heroes. They simply decided to remain whole in a time when almost everyone is sold off in installments. Being part of the remnant is, above all, accepting loneliness as a companion. Not the sad loneliness, but the loneliness of a mature spirit who understands that spirituality is not popular. Carl Jung asserted that the process of individuation requires courage to walk against the grain of the masses. And that is exactly what the remnant does. While the world rushes toward noise, they retreat into presence. While fear dictates decisions, they practice obedience. While the collective shadow tries to dominate, they observe it, without being devoured by it. These are the ones who sustain the invisible balance of the planet, those who continue to love even when love seems naive. They are few, yes, but it is through them that God keeps the thread of hope burning. The self in each of them becomes a small beacon that weathers the storm. But the faithful remnant isn't made of perfection, it's made of persistence. They are people who fall, cry, doubt, but don't give up. What sets them apart isn't how much they know, but how much they persevere. They understand that obedience isn't rigidity, it's rhythm. That presence isn't the absence of pain, but a tension in the midst of it. That the shadow isn't the end, but the mirror that reveals what still needs healing. Carl Jung said that those who look outside dream, but those who look inside awaken. And it's this awakening that keeps the remnant alive. The spirituality that moves them is practical. They pray, work, love, and remain steadfast even when no one else believes. They are the few who, in silence, sustain the whole. And when the world collapses for good, it will be the light of these faithful hearts that will show the way. A path that doesn't end in chaos, but in the promise of a new birth. The true end of the world is the birth of consciousness. When Jesus spoke of the need to be born again, he wasn't calling for a change of religion, but of perception. Carl Jung explained it differently. Rebirth is the moment when the ego ceases to rule and the self assumes the inner throne. It is a silent, painful, and inevitable birth. And no one is born again without first dying within. The shadow, in this process, is the womb. It is through it that the soul is reborn more lucid, more whole, more alive. True spirituality doesn't promise paradise, but the courage to go through hell without losing faith. Obedience becomes the soul's breath on this journey, following even without understanding, trusting even when all seems lost. The self guides the soul firmly, like holding a child by the hands in the dark, until its presence begins to shine from within, and everything that was once pain becomes revelation. Being born spiritually is an act of surrender, and surrender is the most difficult art for an ego trained to control. Carl Jung said that transformation doesn't happen when we try to become better, but when we accept who we are. And that's why inner birth requires courage to face what we've avoided our entire lives. Fear, resentment, lack, pride, all that we hide under layers of normalcy. The shadow reveals itself not to condemn, but to heal. Spirituality becomes medicine and silence, anesthesia. Presence becomes living proof that God dwells not in temples made by human hands, but in the space between suffering and surrender. The reborn understand that obedience is not submission to an external force, but an alliance with their purest essence. The self, once awakened, reorganizes the inner chaos with divine precision, and what once seemed like ruin becomes seed. After inner birth, nothing is ever the same again. The soul stops seeking God above and begins to recognize Him in the present. Prayers change tone. They no longer ask, but simply give thanks. Faith ceases to be hope and becomes presence. And it is at this point that the human being becomes the temple itself. Carl Jung asserted that individuation is the process of becoming what one is. And this is precisely what Jesus called life in abundance. Mature spirituality needs no proof. It simply lives. Obedience becomes natural, almost instinctive, because the soul has finally understood the rhythm of the divine. The self is no longer a concept, it is experience. And when this state is achieved, the world can collapse and nothing is lost, because what was born within is indestructible. It is the beginning of a new humanity and the end of all illusions. But this birth, silent and profound, still requires something: the decision to live according to the truth that now dwells within you. So take a deep breath and ask yourself honestly, are you ready for what's coming? Or are you still trying to save what's already fallen? Carl Jung said, "Those who look outside dream, but those who look inside awaken." And perhaps this is the difference between those who will be lost and those who will go through tribulation. The end doesn't come to scare, it comes to cleanse. What's crumbling outside is merely a reflection of what needs to be rebuilt inside. The shadow always warns before it collapses. The self always calls before it departs. The question is, are you still hesitating, or have you begun to listen to the voice that calls for obedience? Think with me. How many times did God show you the same sign, and yet you returned to Babylon? How many times did fear speak louder than presence? Faith is not theory, it is action. It is spirituality lived, not memorized. The whole world may fall into disarray, but he who has learned to listen to the shepherd remains at peace, even amidst the ruins. And perhaps that is why chaos exists, to separate those who speak of God from those who walk with Him. Obedience is the soul's ultimate act of freedom. Because when you follow what the self shows you, even if the world calls it madness, you discover that true refuge has never been geographical. It has always been internal. Now I ask you, what within you needs to die for the new to be born? What part of your shadow still prevents you from obeying? If this message has awakened you, don't let it die in silence. Write in the comments what the Spirit showed you. Share this video with someone who needs to wake up. And if you want to continue this journey of lucidity and faith, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and walk with us. Because time is passing, and the awakened soul doesn't wait for tomorrow.